In this video, we'll do some more nomenclature, specifically binary compounds, though this time the metals will have variable charges, meaning multiple charges possible. We'll make use of the Science Geek periodic table, available at this website. Let's start off by doing a couple of examples of multivalent metals. So why don't we start off by considering cobalt, which we find right here, and oxygen, which we find right here. Well, we know that oxygen has a charge that's -2, and we know that cobalt could be +2 or +3. Okay, so here we've got our cobalt and our oxygen. Just going to drag them down here so we can see them. Two possible combinations can result from what we're talking about here. We could end up having our cobalt 2+, so let's do that scenario. Cobalt, that's +2, and our oxygen, which is -2. We could have our cobalt, which is +3, and our oxygen is still -2. When I do my crossover, I would end up with CO2O2. We actually reduce that. When they're both the same, we just write it as a single 1 and 1. So my chemical formula would be COO. Here, if I do my crossover, I end up with a very different result. I end up with 2 cobalts and 3 oxygens. So my chemical formula, CO2O3. When we name this, we're using something called the stock system, and it's a nice system. It's clean because it makes use of this charge on the metal. And we write it like this. So before we named the metal and then changed our non-metal to an ide, it's the same sort of thing here. So this is still cobalt and oxide, and this would be cobalt oxide. But the difference here is we have to show the different charges. So we do that by adding in Roman numerals to depict that charge. So this is cobalt 2 oxide, where this is cobalt 3 oxide. Let's do another example. If I was to take iron as a contrast, iron again can have a +2 or a +3, and let's say for example I use the bromine over here. So bromine again -1. So we'll just go ahead and create that scenario over here. So I've got my iron that's +2 and my bromine, which is -1, or I've got my iron, which is +3, and my bromine, which again is -1. I do my crossover and it gives me 1 Fe and 2 Brs, or I get 1 Fe and 3 Brs. Let me just clean that up a little. So again, this would still be called iron bromide in both cases, unless we come up with a way to include the charge. So I take my +3 or my +2 and I make sure that I add those in using my Roman numerals. Pretty straightforward. It's a lot like doing our regular binary compound, only now we have to include the charge on what is called a multivalent metal. That is to say that the metals can have multiple valences or multiple electron charges. Going the other direction could be a bit more challenging. If I was to start off with a formula such as FeO or Fe2O3, it gets into some different things because again, I know my iron has a charge of either 2 or 3, and I know my oxygen's always -2. So if I go ahead and consider that, if I was to undo my crossover, so what's implied here is one of two things. Either there are two charges that are identical, or there are two charges that are each one. Well, we know that iron had a charge, possible charges of +2 or +3. So neither of the charges implied here could have been 1 as a result of that. So we know that the iron has to be either 2 or 3. Well, oxygen is always going to be -2, which meant that would have been a 2. And since it wasn't written and this one wasn't written, it implies they were actually the same subscript, which means this was iron +2. So this would actually be iron 2 oxide. If I was to undo this crossover, it's a bit cleaner. It implies that the iron was +3 and that the oxygen was -2. So here I would have iron 3 oxide. One last example and then we'll do some practice. Here I've got chromium fluoride. Chromium, if I go back to my periodic table, I see can have a charge of +2, +3, or +6. This gets a bit complex. For our purposes, we'll be focusing on these two. If I was to undo this charge, or this crossover, that would bring my 2 up here, implying that my charge on chromium was +2. Same said, this subscript, which is an implied 1, carried back up, would mean that fluorine is a -1. I can verify that by looking at my periodic table, and sure enough, fluorine is a halogen, and it would be a charge of -1. So here I have chromium 2 fluoride. Let's do this one. If I was to undo this crossover, this would be a +3 chromium, and the implied 1 there would make this a negative fluorine. So this would be chromium 1, 2, 3 fluoride. Let's do some practice.